The presentation will be recorded for future use, just letting you all know in advance. I will mention it again during the introduction. All right. Hello, everyone. I believe you should be able to see me right now. Welcome in. Thank you for joining me. And let's start this presentation. Okay, so some introduction first. As I mentioned just previously, we're going to record this presentation. It will be available on demand after the fact, so you don't need to record or take notes. All of the material will be provided if you need it for later. Same with the code and the things that I will be showing you. All of it will be available. What are we going to talk about today? This presentation is a common asked question about ZK. Those can be technical, they can be structural, they can be on a number of topics. They're just questions that we see rather often and that we feel are interesting to talk about because if everyone have some basic understanding of those questions and what they relate to, it will certainly make everyone's life easier. Okay. Who am I? Hello, I am Mathieu Duchemin. I'm a support and consulting engineer here at Podix, who make the ZK framework. And I will be taking you along for the presentation today. About the presentation format, I will be going through use cases, examples, a bit of code, but not too much because this is going to stay rather light for today's presentation. I will try to read the chat as I do the presentation. So if you have any remark or something that would take a sentence to explain or to clarify, feel free to shoot it in the chat, and I will do my best to try to follow on that. However, there will be a longer form Q&A session at the end of this talk. So if you have some longer topic, or if I think I cannot address the whole question directly in one sentence, I will have a longer chat time at the end for everyone. All right, then let's just get started with including a page. So this is a larger topic than it seems, because what do you mean when you say include a page? Essentially, what it boils down to is modular design. I want to have a piece of code that I am able to either reuse in multiple scenarios, or I have a page in which I will want to include one among multiple possible pieces of code. And there are quite a lot of ways to do this in ZK. So I'm going to go over the basics of how you would do it in a number of simple situations. The first situation is essentially templating. I know that in my page, I will have multiple options for a single block. For example, I will create a display/form in which my user will be able to input some value or to be able to read some value, depending if they are in read mode or in input mode. The data itself is the same. The page structure is mostly the same, but I will have in the form perhaps some text boxes when I want them to input, and perhaps some labels when I want them to just be able to read the value. So I will want to swap between those two different templates, and perhaps that form will be reused in also multiple page. So how do we do that? Well, the basic, and there will be GitHub samples. I'm going to show you the code directly. The code I'm going to show you is basically the same as the GitHub sample. It's public, so you will be able to go there and try it out on your own after this call if you are interested in doing so. Okay, so templating. This is my basic page. I have here my standard page, and I have here two templates. I have a normal template, which contain labels. That's just basically display. And I have here editing template, in which I have the same data, but instead of being labels, they are included in text boxes, and I have the ability to change them. How does it look in the page itself? Well, very simply, you can see here my page. I have my button, which will allow me to switch the state, and I am in the timeout. That happens because I prepared my pages before and I forgot that timeout existed, but that's okay. And then I will be able to switch between the normal template and the edit template. So how does this work? I simply have, in this case, a template anchor, which is my apply. And my template anchor is able to switch between either the edit template or the normal template, depending on a value that is, in this case, on my view model. But that's something I could also be doing in a MVC composer. So that's not restricted to MVVM. The templates are declared in the same page. They are in the same space, ID space, as the apply that is consuming them. So it's essentially very low technology because you have everything in a ZUL file and you're just able to say, at this given time, I want my apply component to just represent those three labels, or I want at a given time my apply component to be able to represent those three text boxes and inboxes. The apply component is just going to inject whatever is in the template that you're trying to use into that specific space in your page. So it's going to just put stuff there. So that's level 0. Well, I'm not going to talk too long about this because templating is pretty simple and it can be done in list boxes with a model template. It can be done directly in the page, as I've just shown you here. There's a bunch of documentation available. If you have any question, let me know at the end and maybe we can talk more about it, but that shouldn't take too long. Okay, so now more interesting things, not just modular design, but modular design with actual pages, actual individual document or actual ZUL file that I'm going to load in order to reuse them in multiple places. So first, we're going to talk about the ZK include component, what it is used for, and how it works. So the include component basically is ZK's version of an iframe. It's oversimplifying it. There's a lot more to say about it, but for the general concept, that's how you should think about it. An include is just the output of a page that I put inside a larger page. It's a whole document that is evaluated on its own, and the resulting value of that document is added inside of my main page. So if you look at this schema here, this is the very important part. Oops. When you put an include in the page, you actually create an internal request to that page. So if I include my inner page.zul, my ZK engine at server side is going to receive a new request is going to process the request for that page, is going to compute all of the element of that page based on whatever has been given as the URL, as possible parameter attributes, whatever information I give to it, is going to finish a whole page as the output of that request, and then is going to include the output of that request. So there is a degree of separation between the outer page and the inner page. Is the most important thing you have to understand with the include. There are multiple mode of functionment in include. On function include, there is instant mode, defer mode. There's include with parameter, without parameters. Those will change the details of how that work, but the internal logic that an include is the result of an internal request that is inserted into your page is the core concept that you need to think about when you're including. So how does that look when you're doing an include? Simply put, you are, where's my include sources? That's a very well prepared presentation, my outer and my inner. Where's my outer, where's my inner? There we are. Okay, my outer will look like this. I will have an include component. My include component has a target. It says, this is the file that I want to include. And in this case, this is this ZUL file over here, my inner. And whenever the ZUL parser at server side, which is parsing the content of the page and crafting the response to the request, arrives at that include, it's going to put everything on break and say, okay, we're including content here. So stop processing this page for a moment. We're going to the inner.zul page. We're going to process the entire content of that specific page, output it as a response, and then the result of that response is being included in this location. So how does it look from a client side? Well, from a client side, it doesn't look like much, because from the client point of view, the client did not make two response. It made one, one request. It made one request to the server. The server did a lot of internal processing that contained that internal request response cycle. But from the client point of view, this is pretty transparent. What you have is just the result of the included page being added to your outer page. Okay, let's keep going. There are more things to talk about include. For example, if you use a URL with parameter, my parameter 1 equal my value, as the source of the include, it will automatically put your include in defer mode, which works slightly differently than the include in standard mode. There's a few traps. I will also mention that include is a bit on the older side. That's not exactly a legacy or deprecated component. It still works, but it has been in ZK for a while. So it can be quirky. And if you do changes on the include, you should always make sure that it outputs what you expect it to output. Okay, so what if I just want to just insert components into my page, but I don't want to do double processing or to access the output of a document that is logically separated from my outer page? Then we have the apply component. Apply component is in the ZUTI package. It's part of the shadow elements for ZK MVVM. However, don't let that fool you. It also works in MVC. You can use the apply component in both cases, and it has a very important difference compared to the include. So what's the use case here? It's the same as the include. I have multiple ZUL files. Those ZUL files are reused in a number of places in my application. For example, I will have a menu bar, which is included in all of my screen. Or perhaps I will have a user profile box that is going to be inserted always in the top right corner of my website. Those things do not need to be coded as part of every single page that you make. They can be a ZUL file that contain all of the logic and all of the information and can be inserted at that relevant place in all of your pages. Why would you do it with an include rather than an apply? Well, simply put, the include does not make an internal request. The include, so the apply will not make an internal request. The include will do it. The apply will take a ZOL file, will read the component content of that ZOL file without parsing it, and will place it at the location of the include. Essentially, it will insert the component to be processed inside of the same page. So how does it look like from a code point of view? From a code point of view, we're going to look at the parameter parent, which should be around here. There we go. You will have your apply component. And notice that when I was showing you the template injection before, the apply here was simply grabbing a template defined inside of the same page, which was limiting it to whatever is declared in that specific SOL file. With the parameter parent, parameter child setup right here, it's slightly different. We're using a template URI, and that template URI accepts the internal URI of a ZOL file. So if I look at my parameter parent VM right over there, you will see that I'm using the internal URI for parameter child, which is in this case right here. And the parameter child content, so all of this div, label, etc., will be inserted dynamically inside of the parameter parent page. So this writing this code right here is essentially the same as if you wrote this, as if you just typed in the content of parameter child as a replacement of the apply component. And then once the apply component has resolved the component that it is pointing to, the page is going to keep executing and will finish parsing all of those components as if they were in the same logical page. It will not create an internal forward. It will not create an internal request. It will not parse the content of the apply as a separate document and then insert that into it. It will dynamically put the components into the main page, which is quite powerful and allow more tightly knit together communication between those components. Okay, so that's the basics of the apply. So there is a third quote unquote hidden way to include a bunch of components into a page without making an internal request. And this is to do it manually in Java. So now we're getting quite close to the metal. We're doing something where we're giving up on automation and we're taking manual control of the components. So ZK essentially treats the component of your page as a component tree. You have a root component which contain the first children. Those children have their own descendants. And then you can manipulate that component tree, especially if you're using MVC. That's not something you're going to want to do in MVVM, because in MVVM, you're going to try to keep your logic mostly separated from the component tree and just let the view handle all of that with your data bindings and your comments discussing between the ZOL file and the view model. But in MVC, since you have direct access to the component tree, you can access the execution, which is the representation of the request in your ZK model, in your ZK server. And that execution can just create components from a template from sorry, 1 second. All right, can create component from a template, can create component from a ZOL file, can create component from a page definition. There's a lot of options. They're all a little technical, so I'm not going to go too deep into them. Let's take a look at how it will look. So essentially, we are going to want the load ZUML in Java, which should be somewhere over here. Don't have it open. All right, let me just get to this. That's embarrassing. I forgot where I put it. Load the UML in Java should be in UI composing right here. There we go. So how does that look? This is a Z script. It's used here for the purpose of not having to write a dedicated composer just to show Java code, but it is going to execute Java code as if you were in a composer. It's not something we recommend necessarily to do in production. It's just a convenience for that example. Okay, so how does that work? Execution create components will accept the internal URI of a Zool file, as well as a number of other possible variation of the method, which can accept a page definition, which can accept some component content. You can pass in dynamic strings as a Zool file. There's a lot of possibilities, which I'm not going into too much detail right now, but just keep in mind, it is pretty close to the metal, so it can have at the same time a lot of power, but also a lot of complexity if you're trying to do something very specific. And it will just instantiate the components from that file directly in Java. The result of those components, in this case, are passed to a parent, the content container right here. But you can also assign the resulting components from create component and then manipulate them directly in Java code. So how does that look in a page? It will look pretty much the same as what we've been discussing previously. In this case, we're going to find that I did not refresh that one either. Timeout. We're going to find that we have components being found from the template. So the template that I have declared as a separate Zool file right here. This Zool file just contain a text box with value being sent from the outer page and contain a label created from execution create component. When I trigger this code, it just finds that template, create the component from that template, create them as Java objects, which are then added directly into the outer page. All right, so that's the general way in which you would include a modular object in your Zool page. There are, of course, a lot more options. Not all of them will interest everybody. There's always room for edge cases. There's always room for more complicated solution for specific problems. But that's the basic one. I hope that part was interesting for everybody. Okay, let's go back and continue with the close second to this, which is now that I have composed my page with multiple separate page entity, how do I communicate between those page entities? I'm going to go as well a bit fast because we're already about 20 minutes in and I don't want to keep anyone too long in this. So let's go in directly. So creating a page is generally a good time to pass arguments to that page. We're going to go directly to the last sample I was showing you, execution create components. We are passing an argument from the outer page. This argument in the context of the execution create components can be arbitrary values, which is passed as just a hash map or property. Every way to include a page in another page in ZK have a version of passing arguments to the page. In the case of the apply, you can see that the apply can support arbitrary parameters on the parent right here. I'm loading a param value from the parent object, and then I can retrieve that param value from the inner object. That's essentially because both objects will exist in the same page and they don't need to have some retrieval / declaration between those objects. In the case of includes, we have a similar way to do this. In this case, I will create an arbitrary type argument on the include, which is going to be passed as a request parameter to the inner page. And in the inner page, I will have the ability to just retrieve that argument. Let's see here. You can see that I'm retrieving the execution arg param type, which we declared on the outer include. This execution arg param type will be automatically retrieved and filled by ZK. In the same way that ZK would be able to retrieve an argument sent on a URL with question mark my param equal value, etc., etc., etc. Those are essentially treated the same. And because they are in separate pages request, remember the include is its own internal request, you cannot directly access it in the Zool file. You have to retrieve it either with an execution arg param or inside of the Zool file by using the ZK implicit arg variable, which will automatically wire those. Okay, so that's passing values when creating the page. It's generally where you want to pass your static stuff, where you have a component, a data definition or a user profile, something that is not necessarily going to change in the lifecycle of the included page. But we have more interesting ways to discuss inside of a page. The more interesting is what's happening when you want to communicate between active pages. The use case here is simple. You have two pages inside either the same browser tab or in two different browser tabs controlled by the same user, or in a browser tab on a single user computer and a browser tab in a different user's computer. And you want something to happen which allow those two objects to communicate with each other. The response here is event queues. ZK will provide 4 levels of event queues. So first, what is an event queue? An event queue is essentially a messaging letterbox. You will be able to subscribe to the letterbox, in which case you will receive a new event every time something is being posted in. And you will be able to publish to the letterbox. You will be able to put a message inside of that letterbox, which the other code pieces that have already subscribed will be able to receive. How does that look in code? Well, we have the chat composer right here, which is going to be an easy way to explain how that works. So what do we do in the chat composer? First, we are subscribing to the event queue. This event queue is application-wide, which means that the chat event queue is going to be the same communication channel for every single composer, every single piece of code that will post or subscribe to it for the whole application. That means every user on every computer in every browser that they might be using in every session. When you send something to an application-wide queue, everyone in that application instance will receive it. What do we do with that queue? We publish in the queue, which is right here. We publish events. So that's ZK event, the same event that you would receive when a ZK component does something on click, on change, on select, etc. Except you can just create your own event with your own event names, which means that if you have multiple different events using the same queue, you can separate them by event name. Okay, so what do we do with that event? We put some data, and the data is constructed from whatever we're doing. Here it's chat, so we're just passing in a chat message with usernames, text of the chat message, etc., etc. That's how we retrieve a queue, and that's how we fire to the queue. However, there's one more consideration. We also need to be able to listen to the message that are being sent to that queue. We can do it in two ways. We can do event queues lookup to find the queue as a Java object, and then in the queue we can directly do queue subscribe, which will let us create a new event listener. Autocomplete. Thank you very much. And in that event listener, we are going to be able to do stuff on event. That's very powerful. We can just retrieve a queue and create the subscription directly. We can have our event be prepared as their own class. There's no limit. That's just basic Java. I'm not going to teach you how that works. Okay, but there is also some coding sugar because I'm a lazy person. I don't want to do too much if I can avoid it. If you are in a composer, you can also automatically subscribe with the subscribe annotation on one of your composer method, in which case we're going to tell which event queue we want and at which queue the event queue resides. In this case, we're going to subscribe to the chat event queue, the same one we are retrieving in this line. And this chat event queue is on the application scope, the same as the one we were retrieving manually in this case. How does that look in practice? If I go to my browser tab and I go to my chat, I'm going to refresh because I don't want to have another timeout. I will be able to open two different chat windows. Those are independent from each other. I can even put them side by side so that you can see them easily. I'm going to be user 1 in the left window, and I will be user 2 in the right window. When I type in hello in this composer, in this page, controlled by the composer I was just showing you, I will trigger my publish event, and my publish event is going to be subscribed in all of my applications composer, which have either that subscribe annotation or subscribe to the queue manually, which means that this code block, the code block that is going to create a new label and add it to the page on the info tab, which contain the chat log, is going to be invoked for every single listeners that have that subscription added to them. So the composer for my left page and the composer for my right page, which both have that listener, are both going to be able to consume it. And the same, of course, from the other side. Now we're talking about application-wide communication, because this is subscribed to every single user that may have something open. There are 3 other scopes that you need to know about when you talk about event queues. The cheapest, smallest scope that you will have, let's go to the code. You will be able to see them right here, is the desktop. Desktop essentially means a single ZK page. That might not be a whole browser. If you have multiple ZK page in a single browser, maybe you're using portlets, maybe you're using iframes, or maybe you're using some version of the include, which will create its own internal page. All of those are separate desktop. So they will have a clear separation between who can listen to what. If I do something that is desktop scoped, only a subscriber in the same desktop will be able to get those messages. The second level of scope that we're going to be interested in is the group scope. Group will essentially match a number of desktops, so a number of ZK pages that belong to the same browser. It might be smaller than session scope because it might just be 3 pages in the same browser window, but not the whole browser session. It's slightly more complicated. We have documentation. I recommend, if you're interested in that topic, that you first take a look at the documentation. If you have any question, let me know through email later. Okay, and then the first higher level scope, the session scope. This one target a single user. It will target every ZK page that exists in a browser session. Note that a session contains more than a tab. It contains all of the tabs in all of the windows that are open for a given browser. For that specific user. There are more consideration if you know about session sharing, JSession ID, and all of that. You probably know what I'm talking about. But for the general understanding, you can consider that a session is every single tab open in a browser for a given user. When you choose session scope, your messages will be able to pass to all of the tabs that user control. In the sample that I was showing you previously, I was opening 2 tabs in the same browser session, which means that I would have been able to do this with the session scope. However, because I was using the last one, the application scope, someone over the internet, over a different network, or just a different session in my computer would be able to also receive those events. All right. I believe that's enough clarification on that, and we can always go back at it in the Q&A later if there is any confusion for anyone. Okay, that was a big block. The rest is a bit more fun size, a bit less complicated. So let's wind down and talk about some interesting problems that come up very often, but are more on the simple side of things. Let's talk about component sizings and what can go wrong when you try to give a size to a component. So component sizing in ZK. In ZK, you are manipulating generally Java objects. That's not true for everyone. There's always a more complicated use case. But if you're doing the very, very, very standard use case in ZK, you are putting attributes into Java text box, into Java vlayout, into Java listbox, which are objects generated by ZK, which in turn will generate something at client side that represent the component structure that you're creating. The simplest, most basic way we can give a size to a component is to give it height and width. Height and width are the building blocks of HTML-based page. That's level 0 of CSS. Even if you've never opened a HTML file in your life, there's a very high chance that you already know what I'm talking about. So how does that work? You will be able, in a ZK component, to give any pixel value, person value, or generally whatever would be valid as a height or a width to a ZK component, and the resulting object in the page will receive that height, will receive that width, and the browser will do whatever it needs to do with that height and width. All right, how does that look like in practice? Let's go to code. I'm going to want my hreflex and vflex. There we are. So let's take a look at the very, very first use case right here. That's not the very first, that's the one. So the second use case, I'm a liar. You shouldn't trust anything I say. Okay, so we have a div. That div have a height 200%. What does that mean from the client's point of view? It means that if I look at the div at a client side, the div here is going to have a height attribute on the representation of that div. In this case, it's using CSS height because it's cleaner and it's overridable. But depending on the calculation, it can also be passed as a direct height object, especially in older ZK version. We've done some effort in newer version to be easier to use in that case. So here you see it just directly passed to the component as a direct value. And as a result, the object that is generated by that component is going to be 200 pixel high. So level 0 of HTML sizing, it's good for simple case. You have a child in a container. It's good for static layout. You have a header. It's just always 100 pixel. But what are you going to do if you want something more dynamic? Because that's always the question. ZK have a built-in flex functionality. If you're familiar with CSS Flex, you will find that there is a lot of overlap between ZK Flex and CSS Flex. That's by design because the logic in it is the same. What is flexing? Flexing is a way to tell a component how to size stable condom in a way to, that's a longer question. I'll come back to that at the end in Q&A. Just keep that in mind. We're going to talk about it in the end. Okay, so what is dynamic sizing? You have a container space. That container space can be just the size of your screen. That's the most basic one. Or it can be what is left over after all of my statically sized header and side menu and user profile box and everything have been created. In the rest of that space, I want my page to look nice, so I want the rest of my component to use all of the available remaining space. I don't want to have white space, but I also would like to avoid to have a scroll bar if I can avoid to. So that's where flexing comes into play. At its most basic, when you define either VFlex or HFlex on a ZK component, you're telling that component you want to consume all of the horizontal remaining space for HFlex or all of the vertical remaining space for VFlex. If you have more than one component in a given parent with either HFlex or VFlex, what it's going to mean is whatever value you give as the flexing value for that direction is going to be the ratio for that component compared to its other sibling. So here's a simple example. I have a top container, I have a bottom container. Both of them are in a parent container. The parent container will have a size. I'm not concerned what that size is at the moment. It's not important for flexing. What is important is that the component with VFlex2 will always be half the size as the component with VFlex4 because the ratio between them is 1 to 2. 2 to 4 equal 1 to 2 equal 4 to 8, etc., etc. You just understand the fraction, and then that's what it is going to apply. You can have more than two components. If you have 3 children and they have a ratio, a VFlex ratio, for example, which is VFlex1, VFlex1, and VFlex2, the first two components will both use 25% of the screen, so 1/4. And this last component, VFlex2, will use 2/4 of the screen, so 50% of the remaining space. Okay, that's the basic of VFlex. So now what's the trap? The first trap you have to keep in mind with VFlex is VFlex and HFlex will occupy the remaining space in a parent. So how can that go wrong? You have to understand that if your parent does not have a size, the flexing is going to fail. So in this case, look at that div. That div does not have a size. All right, microphone should be back up. That div does not have a size. What does that mean? That means that when this one here is going to try to calculate its flexing height, is going to inspect the parent and see, well, that one does not have a size. I will consume the rest of does not have a size, and therefore I don't have a size. So you have to keep that in mind. This is going to work because the parent have a size. This is not going to work because the parent does not have a size. And you can go one step further. If you have multiple parents, so a chain of ancestor around your flexing component, you need to make sure that every single of your ancestors have a given size. And that given size need to be something that the component can calculate. So it can be flexing. So in this case, when we calculate that chain of ancestor, we have a base parent that have a height of 200. Can be this one, which will base itself on that parent, and this one, which will base itself on that parent. That is working. However, if you have even one component in the middle that does not have a declared size, then you're in trouble because everything that is under it and is trying to flex is going to fail to flex. All right. Second problem, HFlex mean. HFlex mean is an inversion of flex. Instead of trying to consume all of the available size of the parent, you're going to want to make a component as small as possible as long as it have enough space in order to display all of the content that it has as descendants. So how does that go wrong? Imagine that on my div here, I put a vflex, I forgot my F, a vflex min. In that situation, this component is going to try to size down in order to accommodate the space for all of its children. This component inside of it is going to try to size up in order to consume all of the available space in the parent. As a result, one component is sizing down, one component is sizing up, and they're expecting each other to provide the information of how big should they be. And you create a deadlock in which those two information will collide into each other and will create essentially undocumented behavior. This might be displaying something, it might be displaying 0. It will depend on the state of the page when the calculation happens. Just keep in mind, you want to avoid that in your page. You should either size to a known parent or you should size down to a known children, but you shouldn't try to flex min to a component that is flexing up. All right. Last interesting thing to talk about, how can you define a minimum size limit in case of percentage of flex? So that's very interesting. You can just define style in ZK. And if you are familiar with the CSS styling, you can do something, for example, client, please, Eclipse, thank you. On the style, you can do something like max width, max height, which is going to be parsable by the browser, and which the browser can actually GHT, yeah, that's correct, and that the browser can actually use. So yeah, just CSS in this case. If you have something that is complicated as a page structure, you might want to double check that the CSS that you're writing is working for that specific container. And now we're going to go to another element of that response, which is CSS Flex. If you're using a recent version of ZK, ZK9, ZK9 internally will use CSS-based flexing, which means that you can just type in CSS-based flex rules onto your components, and they will be CSS-based flexing compatible. You can activate or deactivate CSS-based flexing with a library property or with an attribute in your ZOL file. In order to go back to classic ZK flexing. Classic ZK flexing will do JavaScript calculation for the component height and the component width, in which case defining those minimum size limits of percentage and flexing might be a bit trickier. So I would recommend you do it in the more modern CSS-based version. And if you're familiar with CSS Flex, you will be able to see that at client side, if I look at my page, we are going to find those flexing rules. So in this case, display flex direction columns for the elements that are flexing. You can see that they have a flex shrink to control the minimum height of a flexing element. Those are not minimum height, but to prevent it from shrinking below its standard height. That's CSS-based flexing. That's out of the purview of ZK. If you're doing this, I'll just recommend you find a good CSS Flex tutorial to give you good information on that. All right, let's keep going. We still have a few interesting things to talk about. So local dependent resources and internationalization. Here's a use case. You have an application. You have users in multiple countries, and you want to give them a convenient way to consume your application in their native language. However, your application contains some text and you want that text to match the user locale. So user profile, you want it to be in English, in French, in German, in Japanese, in whatever your user is consuming. You will be able to do this with internationalization labels. ZK will automatically detect the locale of the browser when a user consume a ZK page, be it a ZUL file or you're using Portlet or whatever, create your ZK page. And if you define label properties with locale in mind, so in this case, label property in English, label property in German, label property in French, when the page is being loaded, the proper label for that page is being retrieved from the declared property and is being inserted into that placeholder label. You can use this in ZUL. There is an implicit label object as ZUL variable labels, which can be accessed directly to access those internationalization label for the user's requested language. Or you can do it in Java with the labels class. There is more information on the documentation. I'm going to be rather quick about this one, but we can have a quick look here. So in this case, what does it look like in code? In code, I'm going to have my internationalization label declared into my either my webinf or into my into my resources. So in resources, they're going to be here, ZK label properties. In webinf, they're going to be here into the ZK label EN properties. Depending on what the browser locale is detected, those placeholder value will be inserted into the ZUL file or into the Java side of thing when I access, where is my label? Labels.zul is here, when I access my object. So you can see all of those objects, labels S1, label S2, label resources, are coming either from the label properties that are in my webinf or the label properties that are in my resources. You simply have to define the file name containing either the complete locale, so UKEN or FRFR or etc. for the country plus locale, or just the language, just the small part of the locale, EN, DE, FR, and ZK will load the proper label accordingly. Okay. So that's what I was just talking about, declaring it in Java, declaring label, using them. Using the JavaScript labels. So this one is also part of internationalization. It's slightly trickier. So what is it about? ZK will come prepackaged with labels for a number of languages for ZK's internal strings that are being displayed, for example, when you trigger an error on a text box or when there is a communication error with the server. Perhaps you are publishing your application in a country that is not served by the default label, which admittedly there's a lot of default label already, and it will default to English if there is no found label, but who knows, you might be serving something that is not included out of the box. Can you provide labels for that specific country? The answer is yes. You can create your message, so ZK message label, for any given locale. In this case, you will find, for example, the default message in English when a wrong format is being given to a dead box, and you will find the French version when a wrong format is given. La date est requise au format. So how does that work? When you are looking at your dead box right here, if you type something wrong, default message by default is English, is going to be loaded. in this case, my locale is English. So by default, since my locale is English, I'm getting the English message. If I were to be in a different location, so if my location was to be Paris in France, my locale would be French. And when I will be triggering the error message, instead of loading the default message, I'm sorry, locale should be French. There we go. Reloading the page. Instead of loading the English message, I will be loading the French version because I will have the one based on my locale. There's a number of rules as to which file is being loaded and which one is going to be retrieved depending on your locale. Simply put, it's all in the documentation. I'm not going to do all of the reading, but you will have the link at the end if you're interested in seeing how that works. All right. So last thing to say about locale-dependent resources. What about non-ZK files? So not the labels that are automatically loaded by ZK and not override to the default ZK value. What if you have different CSS and you want a CSS for France and you want a CSS for England and you want a CSS for Germany, depending on your user locale? You can do this as well. There is the possibility to add a star character when you declare a script, when you declare a style object, which will be used when parsing that file location. If there is an available file which match that locale, you will be able to retrieve that file. So very simply, if you have my dede.css or a myde.css or a my.css, in order the file with the more specified precise locale will be loaded first. If that one does not exist, the one with a less precise locale will be loaded second. And if none of that exists, the default one without a locale specifier will be loaded. That's also in the documentation. You will have that link at the end. Not going to go too far into it, but that exists. So just wanted to let you know that's something you can actually do in ZK. All right, let's go ahead and talk about client control. This one is also going to be rather short. And what it is first. First, let's talk about the ZK engine. What is the ZK client engine? As you are all well aware, because you're working with ZK already, when you are creating a ZK application, you're working mostly from the Java world. You're declaring ZOL file, which are parsed as Java applications, as trees of components. You're creating components directly in a composer, or you're manipulating the value of Java view models that are then wired to ZOL files. Everything that happened at server side happen in a Java virtual machine, and then the ZK server engine takes the result of your processing and makes it into something that can be displayed in a web browser. That web browser usually is not controlled by the developer because it's out of what you're usually interested in doing. However, there is occasionally the need for the developer to do something that changes the web browser attributes or that retrieve information from the web browser attributes. In this case, there is a convenient class, which is the ZK clients. This class is available here, org-ZK UI util clients in Java. When you're writing your Java code, you can invoke method of this class in order to manipulate the browser that the end user is going to see. How does that work? In the case of the client class, you can just invoke those methods. When the method is invoked, a special response is added to the client response that the browser is going to receive. And when the response is received, the ZK client engine that exists separately inside of the browser, right here, is receiving that data and is doing something to the browser. Here is where your Java code is usually working. Here is where the client in browser is working. And the client's class is called at server side in Java and is having an effect on the browser without you having to write JavaScript code or other browser specific code. So in this specific case, what is my use case of client control? There's a lot, but we're going to talk about a single one, which is asking the user to confirm that they want to close their page. That's a common request. You want the user to make sure that they save their form before they close the page, or you want to ask the user to confirm that they know that their progress is going to be lost if they close the page right now. How do you do it? So web browsers have an API called before unload. That API is not relevant to the Java code of your application, but ZK gives you a simple way to access it and to ask the user to confirm whether or not to close the page. When in your application, you will go to the, where's my page? 1 second. Should be the browser control page. Don't have it open right here. Let's see, right there. There we go. In your Java code, you're going to call clients confirm close. This is something that happened at server side in your composer or in your view model or in any place which is inside of a ZK execution at server side. The client in return is going to receive that information. Going to refresh my page first. There we go. And I'm going to show you the response received from the server. When I go to my network panel, I will be able to see that when I click this button and I invoke the client's confirm close method at Java side, I will receive an instruction telling my client to confirm before closing the page. This means that if at the current time I attempt to close the page, the client side behavior that is being defined here is going to apply that constraint on the client. If I remove it, again, using the server side client confirm close without a value, setting it back to null, I will disable that behavior. I will receive, oops, apologies. I will receive another reply from the server telling me to cancel that instruction. I will now be able to actually close the page without having that yes, no pop-up show up. There is slightly more about confirming before closing a page. So some of you who might be of my age or older and remember the early days of the internet know that in the past you could ask a customized message telling the end user specifically what was the condition of closing or not closing the page. That's unfortunately something that has been removed by modern browsers. We can still ask the user to confirm or leave, but we cannot ask for a specific message anymore. Unfortunately, that API used to be abused by spam websites or by cheating group creating pirate pages. So they ruined the fun for everyone else. Now we only have to work with yes or no. We can't ask the custom message anymore. Okay. What else can you do with the client's class? You can do a lot of things. You can evaluate JavaScript directly. There's a lot of other behavior. I recommend that you take a look at the client's information that is on this page after the talk. If you want to know more about the type of actions you can do on the client, focusing an element, scrolling an element into view, etc., etc. All right, we're almost at the end of our talk, and I'm slightly over time, so I'll ask you to forgive me for the, let's say, 5-10 minutes we're going to take to finish this. Let's talk about the last topic, ZK directives and page level resources. So we've all at some point used the script or the style tag inside of a Zool page in order to insert a script or a style .js, .css, whatever object you have to add to that page. When you put a script or a style inside of the page body, the script or the style for the third-party library for your style is going to be loaded after the initial page rendering because it will be in the body of the document. This can be good because it does not block the execution of the page and the page will load faster. However, what if you have a piece of script or a piece of CSS that absolutely non-negotiable case must be loaded before everything else because your application needs that piece of code to be executed before everything happens in the page. You would then need to move that piece of code from the body of the page to the header of the page. Why is that? When a web browser receives a page content, it will receive two very important HTML elements in that page content, the header and the body. If a script or a style link is located in the header, the page will not process the content of the body until every single object loaded by the headers have been retrieved and have been added to the browser context. However, if your script element is inside of the page body, it will trigger its loading when the page does initial rendering, and it will actually execute at some later point in time when it has finished loading. Why is it a problem? Let's say you are loading a jQuery plugin because you want to add some features to your page that are not out of the box in ZK. Let's say you're loading external software as a service platform like Google tags for tracking or something for advertising, whatever it might be, and you want to be 100% sure when the page has been loaded that this piece of code has been also added to the page. It cannot be at some point in the future. It must be finished when the page is loaded. You would then want to bring that to the headers from the body. How do we do this? We use processing instruction in a Zool file, or we'll use language definition. Let's take first a look at processing instructions. Processing instruction will be in my messages.zool. That's not the one. Pretty sure I had one ready, but I don't remember where I put it. That's fine. If we have, no, yeah, because the message.zool will use the language definition. We're going to talk about this one later. So let's go back to the presentation first. So what is a ZK directive? I'm going to bring the documentation for directive here. It is essentially an instruction that you put at the top of the page and which will make changes to how your Zool file is being processed by the Zool processor at server side. It starts with a smaller than question mark. It ends with a question mark greater than. And inside of it, you will add some page level processing which will affect the result of the page. It can be used for a number of things. So in this case, we can set a title on the page, or we can declare some component directly from a processing instruction. But more importantly, for that specific use case, we can define script, style, and link. Those are essentially representation of a script header, a link header, or a style header that will be added directly into your page in the header and not in the body. That's if you want to do it in a single ZOO file. But maybe you have a use case where you want that Google tracker or that advertisement or whatever loaded globally on every single pages. In that case, you will want to use language definition instead. In language definition, you can define a JavaScript object like this one. And that JavaScript object or that style object, if you use the style version, the link version, depending on what your use case is, will be also parsed in the same way and added to the header for every single page that is loaded in your application. It will insert that link, that script, as a reference in the header, and therefore it will force it to load with the initial page loading. It will block the page processing until that script or that style has been loaded. You may lose a bit of time on rendering. However, you will have the absolute certainty that this object will be available to the browser when you start actually processing the page content. How does it look in browser? If I go back to my sample and I go to my page definition, you will see that in my lang add-on here, I'm declaring a /js/my.js script file that should be loaded with my page. If I go to my document header, I will be able to find right here in the document head the script object generated in this way. And that script object, because it is in the head of the document, will be loaded in the initial page rendering. That's basically it. And that script is pretty simple. If we go to the my.js script, you can see that it just does something after mount. It just does a console log, and you will be able to see that console log happened after mounting the page. So that's basically it. So how do you choose? How do you choose whether you want to put your script or your CSS in the header or inside of the body? If you want faster page load and you don't mind that the resource arrives into the page after a few milliseconds to a few seconds, depending on network condition, put it in the body. It will not block the page rendering, and it will be immediately, it will not be immediately available, but it will arrive whenever the browser finishes to load it. However, if a resource has to be here, if it's absolutely required that the resource has been loaded when the processing start to happen, put it in the header, and the browser page will resolve it before doing anything else in the page. All right. That was a number of that I've just talked through this, but don't mind me. I could have presented that, but it's okay. You can still get all the information I was talking about. So very quickly, I'm not going to go too much into detail. If you want to go very close to the metal, you can also insert arbitrary tags directly in the page using page control. The information about this will be in that Java doc. If you get the presentation after the event, feel free to have a look. For most use cases, this is not necessary. There's usually better way to do it, but it will give you close to the metal access. So there's always the case where you want to do something out of the ordinary and you need the extra control that bypassing all of the automatic stuff and going directly to the API itself will give you. Okay, that was a lot of talking, and we're going to be able to slow down and go to the Q&A very shortly. I'll just point out that all of the example I've been showing you today are available on GitHub in GitHub ZKos ZK Books. You will also have that link with the presentation later. If you want to run all of the samples, or if you want to look at the code in more details, you will be able to find it there. If you have any feedback on this presentation, if there's anything that would warrant a communication with us, we're very happy to receive your emails. We love talking to you and to get your perspective on things. If something didn't make sense, or if something would be better used in such a way that you feel you want to let us know about, just send us an email, get in touch, and we will take all of your suggestions and feedback. That's basically it. So now I'm going to have a short drink because I've been talking like a machine for an hour, and we're going to switch to question and answer if there are any. I see that there's already one for the table being sent earlier. We've talked about the flexing, but we can re-talk about it if it wasn't clear enough. Everyone else, if you're interested to stick with us, we're a bit over the 1 hour mark, but I apologize for that. That was a lot of content. I hope it was interesting and useful for you. And if you decide to leave now, I'll see you on another training next time. Thank you for all being here. All right, let's do this. Question and answer. How to size table columns. Thanks, everyone, and see you again next time if you're not sticking with the question and answer. How to size table column in such a way that in a table we have a fixed width for a particular column and other column sharing the available space in percent that will be using the screen size to max extent. All right. So I'm not sure we're going to build a fully functioning case right now, but we can talk about how that would work. The first thing that you would need to do in that situation, I'm going to just open a new arbitrary file so that I can discuss those things without without affecting any of my just want that as a separate view. Just 1 second, please. Okay, pretty sure I can just extract a window. Now, window extraction is not working as I would like, but that's okay. So 1 second, please. We're going to go low technology with Notepad, because that's going to be the easiest thing we have here. So, okay, how do we want to approach this? So we have a table. First, what table component are we using? We're going to go with one of the two ZK tabular component, which are either grid or listbox. How do we choose? Grid is basically displaying static data. It does not have selection control. It does not have the ability for the user to use the up-down arrow to move selection around. It doesn't have checkboxes to select stuff. So grid, if I just want to do some displaying, and listbox, if I want to have the ability to select row, essentially. Now, how does that work? First, we have our ZK page. Our ZK page, the ZK tag does not actually have a presence as a component. It's just declaring which namespace we're working into. In that namespace, I'm going to have a parent. I'm going to have actually multiple parents. That's not what I was hoping to get. Okay, I'm going to have multiple parents, and all of those parents are going to need to have some size information. As we were discussing previously, we're going to be able to do horizontal flex. We're going to be able to do vertical flex on our ancestor chain, and there can be as many ancestor as there might be. The point being that the grid itself need to be able to have a size, because if the grid does not have a size, it will not be able to consume the available space. So after you have all of your chain of parents ready, you will have your grid component. And on that grid component, we're going to be able to first give it a size. Either it's the only child on that on that parent, and we're going to be able to just give it with 100%, just consume all of the parent, or there is maybe more elements to it. So the grid itself need to have an horizontal flex. Regardless of the case, the grid here will need to have a size declared on it so that it can itself just know what size its outer shape should have. Now, the question specifically is about sizing the columns. When you are in grid, you can define the columns of the grid simply with the columns component. And the columns component itself is going to contain column components, which will have label, ABC, etc., etc. And each of those columns will have different information on them, depending on what they do. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, F, G. Okay. Once we close this, we have our columns ready, and we can start. I see there was another question in the Q&A. I'll come back to it after I finish with the first one. After we get to this point, we can start to give sizing information to our columns. So first, we're going to respect the chain of ancestor, put a hflex1 on the columns. This is not always necessary, but in this case, you're just going to do it to make sure that your chain of ancestor have all proper size. And then you can start to give width. So for example, my first column is going to be 50 pixel, and my other columns are going to share the remaining space. Since they share the remaining space, they're going to use hflex, horizontal flex, with a ratio. So this one will have a ratio of 1. This one will have a ratio of 3, which means that this one will occupy 25%, 1 out of 4 of the remaining space, and this one will occupy 75%, 3 out of 4 of the remaining space. In this case, the grid itself is going to use all of the available space, and inside of the grid, the columns will use all of the available space. And for each columns, the one that have a standard size will first define their own size, and the remaining will use their flexing information in order to have whatever remaining size shared between them. That should be the basic use case. It can become more complicated than that if you have dynamic columns, or if you don't have enough space in a grid to display all of the columns for some reason. But that would be, if you are in such a use case, what I would recommend is that you send just a message to the feedback address that I was telling you, or to support directly, and we can just talk about it in a longer use case. But essentially, what you have to keep in mind for most object is chain of ancestor. Everyone must have a parent that also have a size. And then for all of the siblings, the one that have a defined size will get their size first, and the one that have a flexing size will define their own size based on the remaining space. Okay, so next question. It was in a direct message, so I'm going to read it directly. How internally widget extended from native HTML element and with extra feature, use case of adding customizing list box using mold and overridden the list item of ZK checkbox with GK checkbox using mold is working fine, but the feature of multifunction is working differently. Can you share how to rectify it? Okay, so that's a lot more that I will be able to do in that Q&A. what I would suggest, it sounds that you have already a use case, and instead of trying to replicate that use case during Q&A, which would take time, just contact us by email. Send us the use case with the JavaScript override that you've done so far, and we can take a look and give you some feedback on what was done and what might not be working in this case. Does that sound all right? Okay. Let me know if that's okay. Yeah, perfect. Just send us. I'm going to put back on screen. If you are already in contact with support, you can go directly to our support address. If you're not in contact with support, please just go to the info at zcos.org. Let us know the use case. Please include all of the files that will be important here. Don't just give us a small snippet, just give the whole JavaScript extension file. That would be the easiest solution so that we can run it on our side and see what's going on. All right? All right. I didn't see any other question yet for Q&A. Does anyone else have something in relation to the current topics that would be interesting to talk further about, something that was confusing in what I explained, or that would require some extra details or extra information? I'm going to count 1 minute from now. If you have a question, please put it in the next minute. Otherwise, we're going to end here for today. And if we are ending here for today, I'm going to say thanks for all of you to stay with me for slightly more than 1 hour. I hope that was enjoyable and that you learned something today. As I mentioned earlier, that might not have been the most technical sample we've ever given, but those are questions that came back rather often. So we're happy to be able to give a bit more detail to make sure that everyone have a good understanding of those topics. All right. Thanks everyone. We're going to be hanging here for today. And yeah, no further questions. So have a good day and see you in another training. See you, goodbye.